Okay, I think you guys can hear me now. Um, Sorry about that. Okay, microphone is always going to be that. And exit. Okay. Welcome back, YouTube. Today we are going to be reading the Ranger's Apprentice, Book 10, The Emperor of Nihonja. And as I was saying before, um, we're just doing this for it's because it's therapeutic. I'm not gonna lie. I need to read, and I like doing it like this. So we're gonna do it like this. We're on chapter 17 currently. Uh, I I've already completed this book. We've already read it. A couple weeks ago, I finished it, but when I was reading it, I don't know, I was just spaced out the whole time. I don't remember it at all. So, and I really like this series, and I want to kind of soak it in. This is book 10. I don't know if there's any other books after this one. There might be. I'm not too sure. Um, but this series means a lot to me, so I want to finish it strong. You know. All right, let's get into it. In Okay. Let me close my Steam because I'm not playing anything. Okay. All right, team. Um. Okay. Chapter 17. Evelyn and Alice were practicing their fencing skills on the foredeck under the somewhat bemused eye of Celothan. Evelyn's exploits in Scandia and Arita in recent years had been widely reported throughout Arlowen. She was, after all, the crown princess and enjoyed a certain amount of celebrity. As a result, many Arlowen women and girls had been influenced to take a greater interest in weapon skills. Alice was one of these, but her motivation went beyond following what was currently seen to be fashionable. She had been more than a little frustrated by her inability to defend herself effectively when she was captured by the traitor knight Karen at Castle Mackinaw. She had determined that she would never let that happen again. This new emphasis on martial this new emphasis on martial skills was evidenced by the fact that her dagger, part of the courier uniform, had changed from a narrow needlepoint ceremonial design to a more practical and more lethal heavy-bladed fighting knife. In addition, she had taken to practicing the javelin and to wearing a lightweight saber while on assignments. It was a style of sword rapidly gaining popularity with girls her age. Evelyn had a similar weapon, and when they had discovered the fact, it was only logical that they should practice together. Logical, perhaps, but not wise. One of the ship's crew had carved wooden practice weapons for them, and the two girls had begun a daily training routine. Celothan had offered his services as an instructor and referee for watching after watching the first few sessions, and both girls had accepted the offer. Very well, he said now. Fighting positions, please, ladies. That's debatable, Holt said in an undertone to Will as they stood watching. A number of the off duty crew had gathered to watch as well. There was a certain enjoyment to be in watching two extremely attractive girls trying to split each other's skulls open with wooden swords. The fighting part or the ladies' part? Will replied with a grin. Holt looked at him and shook his head. Definitely the ladies, he said. There's no debate about the fighting. Will shrugged. He knew that there was an edginess to the girls' relationship and that it had something to do with him. Why that should be so, beyond him. Weapon a little higher, Evelyn, Celothan said. You tend to drop your guard too low. He waited as she adjusted the position of her sword, then glanced at Alice to see if she was ready. The blonde girl had an edge over the princess in skill, he had noticed. Probably because she had more focus on approach to her swordsmanship. When she practiced, a small furrow formed between her brows, evidence of the concentration and sense of purpose she was putting into her moves. Evelyn, on the other hand, was a little slapdash in her approach. She had taken lessons in the saber for some time, but never with any particular dedication to the weapon. She was faster than Alice, but Alice, tall and athletic, had a longer reach and stride. and Evelyn tended to let herself get off balance too often. Begin, Celestine said, with a sense of resignation in his voice. He had a fair idea of what was about to happen. Evelyn lunged forward to attack, as he knew she would. She was too impulsive, he thought, too inclined to want to get things started, without any preliminary sparring. Alice knew it too. She had waited calmly for Evelyn's rapid attack. She swayed to one side as Evelyn lunged, deflecting the thrusting wooden blade past her body. Evelyn staggered slightly, losing her balance. Then Alice cut back with a quick wrist movement, laying her own blade across Evelyn's knuckles with a crack that made the spectators wince. Money changed hands among the watching Scandians. Ow! 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 Evelyn yelled. Her sword clattered to the deck and she nursed her bruised hand, glaring at Alice. Then she turned angrily to Celestine. She did that on purpose! But before Celestine could reply, Alice chimed in with equal vehemence, color flaring into her cheeks. Well, of course I did it on purpose. That's why we're practicing, isn't it? To do things on purpose? Or are we trying to practice accidents and flukes? Please, ladies, Celestine began. He was unmarried and so had little experience with women. He was beginning to wonder if he ever wanted any. But it's true, Celestine, Alice protested. She always leaves herself open to that reply. Which you always manage to make, Evelyn said angrily, taking her sword from the grinning Scandian who had retrieved it for her. Thank you, she said briefly. The sea wolf leaned a little closer to her. Kick her in the shins next time, princess, he said in a whisper. I've got money on you. Alice failed to notice the exchange. She was still appealing to Celestine as the referee of the bout. I mean, she's got to learn, hasn't she? If this was a real fight, she wouldn't get a do-over. She wouldn't have a hand. On the other hand, Celestine said, instantly regretting the words as he heard the Scandian snigger at the unintended pun. If you simply do that every time, we will never progress past this point, will we? Alice seemed to consider the point. I just got a huge itch in my ear. What the heck? Okay. Okay. Then reluctantly she agreed. Very well, Celestine. If you say so. She turned to Evelyn. All right, princess. Your hand's off limits from now on. Will shook his head despairingly. Oh, Alice, 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 he said under his breath, just loud enough for Halt to hear him. Wisely, the bearded ranger said nothing. Don't do me any favors, Evelyn said, through gritted teeth. She flexed her hand on the sword's hilt, trying to ease the pain in her bruised knuckles. Celestine looked doubtfully at the two girls. Both had high color in their cheeks now. Perhaps we should call it a day, he suggested. You can, Evelyn said, her eyes fixed on Alice. I don't feel like it. Alice smiled at her, a smile completely devoid of good humor. Well, neither do I, she replied sweetly. There was a long pause, and then Celestine accepted the inevitable, and with an eloquent shrug of his shoulders. All right then, ladies. He glanced at Halt and rolled his eyes at the word. Halt nodded gravely. Positions. Celestine noted that Evelyn's guard position was correct this time. Perhaps, he thought, she will learn from all this and not go rushing into the fight. And perhaps, he thought, the great blue whale that the Scandian believe causes the rising and falling tide will leap from the ocean, sprout wings, and fly in a circle around the ship. Begin, he said in a resigned tone. And there went Evelyn, like an arrow from a bow, springing across the deck and swinging a series of rapid overhead cuts at her opponent. Backhand, forehand, and backhand again. The strokes were clumsy, but her speed made up for the fact. Alice, expecting another long thrust, was caught by surprise and forced to give ground, backing away and parrying the blows desperately with her own blade, so that a series of clacks and cracks rang out across the deck. There was a low murmur of encouragement from the Scandians, who had backed Evelyn to win. It should be noted that they had done so only because their shipmates had offered generous odds of 3-1, hard to resist in a two-person contest. But then Evelyn's impulsiveness got the better of her. At the point where she should have seen that Alice had recovered her own rhythm and weathered the attack successfully, she persisted with one stroke too many. Unable to sustain the lightning speed of her first half-dozen blows, she had slowed noticeably, and Alice, now back in control, flicked her final stroke to the side, then threw in another wristy backhander. This time, however, Her blade cracked painfully off Evelyn's elbow. Ow! Evelyn screeched. You great gangly cow! What the fuck? The sword dropped to the deck once more. Her arm and hand were numb and tingling. Alice's riposte, whether intentionally or not, had caught her on the nerve at the point of the elbow. Alice, Celestine said angrily. We agreed. We agreed that her hand was off limits, Alice said, all injured innocence. And I hit her elbow, not her hand. If we're going to... Ow! The sudden howl of agony was wrung from her as she felt a searing pain in her right leg. Evelyn, cradling her numb right arm with her left, had stepped in and swung her boot hard into Alice's shin, tearing her tights and scoring a long, shallow wound on the edge of the bone. Alice, her face wrinkled in pain, hobbled sideways to the bulwark and rested against it. She glared at Evelyn, then glanced down and realized that she had still had her own sword in her hand, whereas Evelyn was unarmed. She started forward. Enough! Halt bellowed. All eyes turned to him in surprise. Even the Scandians looked impressed at the volume he'd mustered. Halt looked angrily at the two girls, both nursing their injuries, each furious with one another. Will you two stop squabbling and squalling like a pair of spoiled, self-centered brats? Halt continued. I am sick and tired of the two of you. Both of you should know better. Alice's eyes dropped from his, and she stood, shamefaced, before him. Evelyn, however, was still angry, and ready to assert her own dignity. Is that so, Halt? May I remind you that this particular spoiled, self-centered brat is your royal princess? Halt spun round on her. His eyes were glittering with fury, and Evelyn, in spite of herself, took a pace back. She had never seen Halt so angry. Royal princess? He said with contempt. Royal princess? May I suggest royal princess that you tell that to someone who gives a flying fig about it? If you weren't nearly full grown, I'd put you over my knee and tan your backside for you. What the? Let's see. Okay. Evelyn was scandalized by the idea. If you laid hands on me, my father would have you flogged. Holt snorted derisively. If your father were here, he'd hold my cloak while I did it. Evelyn opened her mouth to reply, then paused. Truth be told, knowing her father, she thought Halt was probably correct. Now, for God's sake, will you two start behaving like a princess and a courier? Halt told them. If you don't, I'll have to think about sending Will home. Me? Will said, his voice breaking into a high-pitched squeak of indignation. What's it got to do with me? It's all your fault, Halt shouted irrationally. And as he said it, the two girls realized he was right. Jealousy over Will was making them behave like little children. Alice was the first to respond. She thought it was only fair, as she had been the one most at fault. She dropped the sword, took a step toward Evelyn, and held out her hand in peace. I'm sorry, Evelyn. I behaved atrociously, she said miserably. Her sincerity was obvious, and Evelyn, who was quick to anger, was equally quick to forgive and see her own faults. She took the hand. My apologies too, Alice. I shouldn't have kicked you. Is your shin all right? Alice looked down to where a trickle of blood was running down her shin. Not really, she said with a lopsided grin, but I guess I deserved it. No guessing about it, Holt said. You definitely deserved it. But he regarded the girls keenly and nodded in satisfaction. He was all too aware of the tension that existed between them and had known that this day would come, sooner or later. Better to have it sooner and be done with it, he thought. When he spoke, his voice had lost the harsh edge of his previous statements. Perhaps we should forego further fencing lessons for a while, he said, and the girls nodded. Celathan gave a deep sigh. I'm for that. There was an awkward pause. Finally, it was Gundar who broke it. I don't know if anyone's interested, he said tentatively, but there appears to be a pirate ship heading our way. Nisibawada. Okay. Chapter 18. The party of Senshi riders emerged from the forest in a ragged formation and drew rein in on the small communal area of Riverside Village. Nothing stirred in the village. The forest birds, which had grown silent with the noisy passage of the strangers, gradually began to sing again in the trees around the little circle of cabins. The small river that ran on the far side of the village, and gave the place its name, gurgled and chuckled over the rocks in its shallows. The noise seemed abnormally loud in the silence. The lead rider twitched his reins impatiently, glaring around the silent, seemingly empty huts. Kikari, he shouted, show yourselves! We want food and drink, and we want them now! The forest seemed to swallow his voice. There was no reply, only the birds and the river. There's no one here, Twee, said one of the riders, using the leader's rank of lieutenant. The officer glared at the man who had spoken. He was tired. He was saddle-sore, and he was becoming increasingly angry with the Kikari, who either refused to answer his questions or fled into the forest at the first sign of him and his men. Time these insolent peasants were taught a good lesson, he thought. He dismounted stiffly, taking a few paces to stretch his tired muscles. Riding in this mountainous terrain, with its constant switching of slopes and angles, was an exhausting business. Dismount, he told his men, and they followed his example. He jerked a thumb at the man who had spoken. You, go and search those cabins. He indicated 3 of the larger cabins, grouped together and facing onto the common ground. You go with him, he ordered a second warrior. The 2 men, hands on the hilts of their long swords, strode with long-legged swagger. They mounted the steps of the closest pair of cabins. The first man kicked open the door, shattering the doorpost so that the door hung crookedly from one leather hinge, and strode inside, his muddy boots marking and scratching the carefully polished wooden floor. It was the ultimate act of arrogance among the Nihon Jan to enter a home without removing shoes. Those outside heard his boots ringing on the floor as he moved through the cabin. After a short while, he appeared at the doorway. Empty, he called. The other man had been searching the next cabin, and now he too reappeared. Same here, he said. They've all gone, it seems. The lieutenant mouthed a quiet curse at the absent villagers. Now he and his men would have to forage for food in the village, and prepare it themselves. That wasn't work for Senshi, he thought. It was work for the peasants who were born to serve them. He reflected angrily that the villagers would probably have hidden their stores before they fled. More time wasted, more inconvenience. All right, he said curtly. Burn those cabins. The cabins, judging by their prominent position, probably belonged to elders of the village. Well, they learned not to make a Senshi warrior stand waiting when he required their service, he thought. There was a light breeze blowing, and the odds were that if he burned the 3 cabins he'd indicated, the flames would spread to the rest of the buildings, destroying the village completely. Too bad, he thought harshly. Next time, they might run away if they knew this could happen. The men had taken a lantern from the veranda of the largest cabin, and were busy with flint and steel to light it. Once they had a source of flame, they'd fashion rough torches and use them to set timber and thatch cabins alight. The lieutenant rubbed his forehead with his clenched fists, stretching away the stiffness. He'd enjoy seeing the cabins burn, he thought. It always gave him a certain feeling of satisfaction to see a building flare up, then eventually collapse in upon itself in a pile of smoking ash. The men had 2 bundles of straw and kindling gathered now, and they set the lantern's small flame to them, letting them flare up. They looked questioningly at their leader and had made an imperious gesture with the back of his hand. Get on with it. Give me 1 second. Okay. Get on with it. As they turned toward the largest cabin, a voice called from behind them. Lord, please, don't burn my house, I'm begging you. A ragged figure, in a plain kikari robe, came running from the trees that circled the village. 2 senshi moved to intercept him, but the officer curtly told them to let the man through. He stopped a few meters from the officer and dropped to his knees, head bowed. Please, Lord, don't destroy our village, he said in a servile tone. The officer's hand dropped to the hilt of his sword and he took a pace closer to the kneeling figure. Who are you? I am Jito, Lord. I am headman of this village. How dare you keep me and my men waiting? The officer raged at him and Jito's head sank lower. Where are the villagers? Lord, they ran away. They were frightened. And you didn't stop them? I tried, Lord, but they wouldn't listen to me. Liar! The word was shouted, and the kneeling man flinched at the violence behind it. You are a liar! You ordered them to go, and you told them to hide any food from the village from me. No, Lord, Liar! The word was shouted even louder this time. The officer was working himself up into a frenzy of hate. His men exchanged glances. They had seen this happen before, and they knew what fate lay in store for the kneeling village headman. No, Lord, please. You are lying to me, and you have insulted me and my men. Where's your hospitality? Where is the respect due to members of the Senshi class? You filthy Kikri should be on your knees, begging us to eat your food and drink your rice wine. We honor you by coming to your village, and you shame yourselves and insult us by running away into the forest like thieves. No, Lord, please, we will be glad to. Shut your lying mouth, the lieutenant screamed. I'll show you how we deal with thieves, and then I'll burn your village to the ground. There was a ringing hiss of steel against lacquered wood as he drew his longsword from its scabbard, taking a 2-handed grip. Kneel straight and bow your head, thief, he shouted. Finally, the headman seemed to accept that pleading would do no good. He had been sitting back on his haunches, but now he knelt upright and bowed his gray head forward, resigned to the lieutenant's sword. The lieutenant raised the long weapon above his head, preparing to sweep down. He emitted a grunt of animal pleasure as he paused at the top of the stroke. Then things happened very quickly. The kneeling headman suddenly came onto his right knee. There was another ringing hiss, and his hand emerged from under the ragged kikri cloak with a gleaming senshi short sword. Using the purchase of his still grounded left foot, he thrust forward, burying the blade in the lieutenant's midsection. The lieutenant looked in startled horror at his attacker. Now, as the ragged cloak was cast aside, he saw that this was no elderly, whining villager. It was a fit, strong senshi warrior, his black hair powdered with ash as to make it look gray. On the breast of his fine leather vest was emblazoned with a triple cherry symbol. The sword fell from the lieutenant's hand and he doubled over, dead before he hit the ground. Quickly, Shukin switched the short sword to his left hand, stooped and retrieved the lieutenant's longer weapon. The men from the raiding party had been stunned for a few seconds, but now they drew swords and prepared to avenge their leader's death. They weren't completely sure how it happened. One moment the villager had been cowed into submission. The next, their officer was staggering and falling before him. Whatever had happened, the treacherous villager would die for it. But even as they moved, other figures appeared from the trees behind them, running to flank them and cut them off from Shukin. The two men who had been sent to fire the cabins were close to him, and he turned to face them. He blocked the first man's cut easily, flicking the sword to one side and, in the same motion, cutting back so that his own blade bit into the man's neck. As the man fell, Shukin blocked the second man's cut with the short sword in his left hand, then spun to his right, his longsword reaching back over his right shoulder as a part of the movement and taking the enemy senshi high in the chest. He stepped clear as the man fell, a few seconds after his comrade. Now the remaining raiders had no time to avenge their fallen leader. They found themselves surrounded by 30 armed senshi warriors, all wearing the Emperor's crest. For a few brief minutes, the clearing rang with the clash of swords and the cries of the injured. Arisaka's men fought fiercely, but they never had a chance. Horus, assigned to guard the Emperor in one of the second row of cabins, watched the fight curiously. Each of the enemy was surrounded by 2 or sometimes 3 of Shigeru's men, yet they never attacked all at once, choosing instead to engage the raiders in a series of single combats. He remarked on this to the Emperor, and Shigeru simply nodded. "This is the way it is done," he said. "It is not honorable to fight 3 at a time against 1 man. We win or lose as individuals." Horus shook his head. "Where I come from, once a fight starts, it's all in and devil take the hindmost," he said. He saw that Shigeru didn't understand the expression, but he made no attempt to explain. Gradually, the sounds of fighting died away as the last of Arisaka's men were cut down. But they hadn't gone easily. 4 of Shigeru's warriors also lay silent on the blood-stained soil of the common ground, and another 2 were nursing wounds. Shigeru and Horus left the cabin where they had been concealed and moved out to join Shukin. Gradually, the villagers began to reappear, drifting back in from their hiding places in the forest. They regarded the fallen senshi with something like awe. Jito looked at Shigeru and inclined his head slightly. "This was good work, Lord Shigeru." Aiko, too, had a look of satisfaction on his face. These were the men who had killed his friends and neighbors and destroyed his village while he was forced to stand by and watch. It was good, he thought, to see that the shoe was on the other foot. But Shigeru was looking troubled. He indicated the blood-stained forms on the ground. "Arisaka will hear of this. He'll hold you responsible, and he'll declare war on the Kikuri people," he said. Jito threw a disparaging glance at the dead raiders. His shoulders straightened, and his head came up proudly. "Let him! Lead us to the Rankoshi and teach us to fight, Lord Shigeru. The Kikuri are declaring war on Arisaka." There was a growled mutter of agreement from the people of both villages as they heard his words. They gathered around Shigeru, touching him, bowing to him, pledging their loyalty. Shukin and Horus exchanged grim smiles. "We have men," Shukin said. Horus nodded. "Now we just have to turn them into warriors." Oh. All right. One more. Chapter 19. Back to the pirate ship now. The pirate ship was a long, low galley, narrow-waisted and mounting 12 oars on each side. She had a small mast and a square sail, but for the moment the sail was furled. As she approached the wolf ship, the 2 banks of oars rose and fell in perfect unison. "Can we outrun her, Gundar?" Holt asked. As ever, Gundar glanced at the sky, the sail, and the other ship, then sniffed the air experimentally before answering. "As long as this wind holds, no problem," he said. He called an order to the sail trimmers, and they hauled on the sheets, bringing the sail to a harder curve. At the same time, he nudged the tiller slightly so that the bow of the ship swung a few degrees to the port. Instantly, Will felt a tremor run through the decks as the ship leaned, then accelerated. Holt was rubbing his beard thoughtfully, still watching the pirate galley behind them. He estimated that there were 40 or 50 men in her crew. He could see her captain leaning forward to yell encouragement to his rowers as he realized that they were losing ground to this strange ship with its triangular sail. "And if the wind drops?" Holt asked. Gundar shrugged. He too studied the pirate craft. 12 oars aside to our 8, he mused aloud. Under oars, she's probably faster than us. Holt turned that information over in his mind, then added, "And she's not likely to be the only one of her kind we sight." Gundar nodded. "The sailing notes say these waters are infested with pirates." The ranger studied the pirate galley again. Under a renewed effort from her rowing crew, she had made up a little distance on Wolfwill. But now, after the initial surge of enthusiasm, they were beginning to drop back again. Wolfwill's oars were shipped, and at least half her crew were relaxing on the rowing benches, out of sight. Chances were that the pirates thought she was a traitor, manned by only a dozen or so men. Can you let her catch up to us without them realizing you're doing it? He asked. Gundar, for once, answered immediately. Easily, he said, grinning evilly. I take it you want to give them a little surprise? Something like that. Halt glanced at the men on the rowing benches. Get your weapons ready, but stay out of sight, he called. He was answered by at least a dozen wolfish grins from the Scandians. Sea wolves love to fight, he thought. Gundar, meanwhile, eased the bow a little back to starboard and called more orders to the sail trimmers. The sail came even tauter, and the ship heeled a little farther. It looked impressive, but the reality was that she came off her best point of sailing and lost speed in the maneuver. The pirates began to gain on them once more. There were a dozen of them gathered in the prow of the galley, yelling threats and waving weapons at their quarry. They're a rattle-tailed bunch, Will remarked. Do you want me to start the ball rolling? He had an arrow knocked to the bowstring, and the galley was in easy range now. But Holt shook his head. Not yet. He glanced to where Evelyn and Alice were standing by the rail. Evelyn had her sling ready, slowly swinging it back and forth. Alice, he saw, had changed her practice saber for the real thing. She had it belted around her waist. You two move back here, he said, indicating a position in the stern of the ship. Reluctantly, they obeyed. They might have argued with him earlier, but both of them knew that when the ship was about to go into fight, Holt's orders were to be obeyed without hesitation. You can knock a few over with that sling as we get closer, Holt told Evelyn. Then he glanced at Alice. You watch her back in case any of them get on board. Alice nodded. Is that likely? She asked, with a faint grin. She'd seen the fighting qualities of Scandians, particularly this crew, in the past. I doubt it. Then addressing Gundar and his crew, Holt laid out his plan. We'll turn up into them as they get closer and take them bow and bow, grapple them, then board them over the bows and disable their ship. What about their crew? Niles called from the rowing benches. If they get in the way, disable them too, he said shortly. Get rid of their mast, knock holes in the hull, then get back on board. You want us to sink her? Gundar asked, and Holt shook his head. No, I want her badly damaged, but capable of making it back to the port. I want the word to go out that the strange ship with the red falcon insignia, he gestured to Evelyn's insignia, flying from the mast top, is manned by dangerous, hairy maniacs with axes and is to be avoided at all costs. That sounds like us, Gundar said cheerfully, and a rumbling growl sounded in the throats of the crew. Jens, he said now to one of the sail handlers, you take 8 men up to the bow. Have grapnels ready and lead the boarding party when they've got her secured. I'm going too, Skirl. It was Niles' rope hander from his position on the front port side rowing bench. Gundar nodded. First 4 rows from either side follow Jens aboard her, he said, but stay out of sight for now. Show yourselves only when I give the word, Holt called. We want the fight of your lovely faces to be a big surprise for these lads. Again, a growl of assent from the crew. They lived for this sort of encounter. Several of them were already chuckling at the thought of the panic that would fill the pirates' hearts when they realized that the helpless-looking, apparently unarmed sailing ship was literally a wolf in sheep's clothing. A sea-wolf in sheep's clothing, in fact. Evelyn, let's see what you can do, he said quietly. The princess needed no further urging. She already had an egg-shaped lead shot loaded into the pouch of her sling. Glancing around to make sure she was unimpeded, she whirled the sling up, let it circle twice, then released and sent the shot whizzing on its way. They could follow the flight of the shot for a few seconds, then lost it against the mass of the galley. But a second later, one of the shouting, gesticulating pirates in the bow suddenly toppled over, folding up like an empty garment. His companions stepped away in shock, silenced for a moment, then redoubled their threats and insults, urging their rowers to go faster and catch this insolent intruder. They were a ragged group, as Will had mentioned, wearing tattered white and colored robes and dirty turbans. They were generally thin and dark-skinned. As they grew closer, Will could see that their weapons were a mixture of curved swords, dirks, and knives. There seemed to be no uniformity among them, and Will guessed that they were more accustomed to slaughtering helpless crews than fighting trained warriors. Holt nodded approvingly at Evelyn's successful shot. Interesting. Just 2 spins, he said. In Arita, you spun the sling around a lot more before releasing. I've been practicing, she said. Spinning it too much warns your enemy and leaves you exposed to return shots. The ideal is to get maximum velocity in one spin, but I'm not up to that yet. She reached into her leather pouch, slung over her shoulder, and took out another of the specially shaped lead projectiles. The days of using river pebbles were long past. Shall I do another? Holt regarded the oncoming pirates. His eyes slitted against the glare of the sun from the sea. No, I think we've stirred up that hornet's nest enough. Once we've grappled them, you can let fly at that group around the tiller as much as you like. He turned away to Gundar. Any time you're ready, Skrull. Gundar judged distance and the angles and the set of his sail. Coming about, he bellowed and leaned over onto the tiller. The ship swung neatly, and the wind going out of the sail as she turned, leaving the canvas flapping wildly. Down sail, he roared, and the bloom and sail thundered down to land on the deck. Hastily, two of the sailing crew gathered the flapping canvas in out of the way. On board the pirate galley, there was a sudden silence as their quarry unexpectedly swung around to face them. Show yourselves, sea-wolves, Holt yelled, and 16 big, heavily armed men appeared from the rowing benches to supplement those already in the bow of the ship. The pirates, expecting to attack a dozen or so lightly armed sailors, suddenly found themselves facing at least 30 yelling, hairy denizens, all armed with double-headed battle axes. At the same moment, two grapnels sailed out from the bow of the ship and thudded into the woodwork of the pirate galley. The captain, aft at the tiller, started to scream orders to his men to cut the ropes that were now drawing the ship closer to the foreigner's craft. He gesticulated to the rowers to the backwater and pulled them away from this unexpected danger. Will heard a quick whizzing sound as Evelyn whirled and cast again. The pirate skipper abruptly reared up, clutching his forehead, then crashed over backward onto the dock. There was a grinding crunch as the two ships drew together, and the yelling, battle-mad Scandians poured over their own bow and onto the deck of the galley. Most of the pirates gathered in the bow took one look at the huge men and their huge axes and ran for the stern. Some of them took a shorter escape route and dived over the rail into the sea. The few who remained to fight had little time to regret their choice. The boarding party, led now by Niles, who had forced his way past Jens, smashed through them, scattering their limp bodies to either side. Several of the boarders, directed by Jens, dropped into the rapidly vacated rowing benches and smashed their axes into the hull's planks below the waterline. Seawater gushed in through the massive rents they created. Satisfied with their work, they then busied themselves throwing oars overboard while their companions hacked at the stays holding the ship's low mast in place. One man swarmed up the mast itself and released the sail, then slid rapidly down again. The sail filled with wind and strained at the mast. Unsupported, the mast withstood the pressure for a few seconds. Then there was an ugly crack and it sagged to leeward, taking a tangle of sailcloth and cordage with it. Guys, I have absolutely no idea what half these words mean because I am not a sailor, nor do I know anything about boats. All I know is that these freaking Vikings are beating the shit out of these fake pirates. Anyways, Gundar glanced at Holt. The ranger had been assessing the damage to the galley and her crew. Nearly half the pirates were killed or disabled, and the ship was already settling in at the bow. Time to let the remaining pirates make repairs and take news of this very unwelcome foreign ship back to their lairs on the coastline. Bring him back, he said, and Gondar bellowed to his men. Back on board, sea-wolves, back to the ship. The men began to scramble back to the bow of the galley, clambering from there up to Wolfwill, which stood higher than the pirate ship. Their comrades on board helped them over the bulwark. Niles was the last to come. Initially, he was fighting a one-man rearguard action. Then the pirates seemed to realize that there was no future in coming within reach of that whirling battle axe that they left at the deck to him. Annoyed, Niles spread his feet, brandished his axe, and yelled a challenge at them. Come on, you raggedy bum backstabbers! Come face a real pirate! But there were no takers, and he actually began to advance down the deck toward them again. Niles, get back on board, you great idiot! Gundar's bellow cut through the fog of anger and battle madness that filled Niles' mind. He stopped, shook his head, then turned and grinned sheepishly. Coming, squirrel! Will had to smile. Niles sounded like a naughty boy answering his mother's call to dinner. Niles made one last insulting gesture at the pirates, then turned and ran lightly back to the bows. Disdaining help, he sprang from the pirate's bulwark back aboard. Cut the grappling ropes, Gundar called, and two axes swung and thudded in quick succession, severing the two ropes. No longer fastened together, the ships began to slowly drift apart. Gundar looked down at the last four ranks of rowers on either side, the men who had remained aboard Wolfwill through the brief one-sided battle. Out oars! Give way! He ordered. As the men reacted instantly, Will realized that the Scandians had done this sort of thing many, many times before. Wolfwill slowly gathered sternway under the thrust of the 8 oars, and the gap to the pirate ship widened. Hoist the sail, Gundar ordered, and the boom and sail ran smoothly up the mast. Sheet home! In oars! He called, and the sail handlers hauled in on the sheets and hardened the flapping sail to the wind. Wolfwill's bow strung downwind, and as the squirrel leaned in on his tiller, she began to gather away. Behind them, the pirate galley was bowed down in the water, and her men were swarming forward to repair the massive holes smashed in her planks before she went under. Gundar nodded in satisfaction. His men had performed well. He jerked a thumb at the half-submerged pirate ship. I doubt we'll be hearing from them again, he said. Salathan was watching the wallowing ship as her crew worked to stop her sinking. You know, he said to Halt, without any trace of a smile, it might have been simpler to have the two girls board her with their practice swords. They exchanged a long look, then Halt shook his head. I needed to leave some of them alive. Alright, let me see how long this next chapter is. I'm kind of hungry. Oh, this isn't bad. Okay. We're going to read one more chapter. Chapter 20. With each passing day, their numbers grew. As the Emperor's party clawed and stumbled up the steep, muddy mountain tracks, climbing on one ridge, descending on the other side, then climbing the next, which always seemed to be steeper and higher than the one before it, more and more Kikiri quietly joined their group. They would emerge silently from the trees, having traveled secret and dangerous paths known only to the mountain people, make a simple obeisance to Shigeru, then attach themselves to the column. The leaders of the column learned, without too much surprise, that the Senshi patrol they had defeated at Riverside Village was not the only advance party sent out by Arisaka. There were more than half a dozen other small groups combing the mountains, brutalizing the Kikiri, burning their villages, and torturing their leaders in an attempt to learn Shigeru's whereabouts. This barbaric behavior, intended to cow the Kikiri into submission, was actually self-defeating. The Kikiri were a profoundly law-abiding people, and they placed great value on the concept of legal and rightful succession to the throne, even if they had never seen the Emperor himself. Shigeru was the rightful Emperor, and their deeply felt sense of morality told them that he must not be deposed by force. Arisaka's depredations only served to convince them that he was a would-be usurper, whose attempts to gain power bordered on sacrilege and must be resisted. And, as a corollary to that, Shigeru must be supported. So, as villages were plundered and burned, the Kikiri joined Shigeru's party, in dribs and drabs, until there were several hundred of them, toiling up the precipitous tracks over the mountains, helping carry the wounded in their litters, and bringing much-needed supplies of food with them. It was hard going, even for the mountain-bred Kikiri, and the need to carry the wounded slowed them down. Shuken, Shigeru, and Horus were constantly aware that Arisaka's main force was somewhere behind them, closing the gap between them each day. If only we knew where he was, Shuken said. He had called a brief halt at noon, and the bearers had gratefully set down the litters and sprawled beside the track. Some took the opportunity to eat a little of the food they carried. Others simply lay back, resting and regaining their strength, trying to let a few minutes' respite ease the ache of strained muscles. Without anything being said, Horus had become one of the small group leading the trek. Shigeru had recognized his worth as an expert warrior and an experienced campaigner, and was grateful to have someone share the burden that his cousin Shuken had assumed. Looking at his two supporters now, the Emperor smiled ruefully. They were far from the idolized picture of a royal party, he thought. Exhausted, mud-stained, grimy, and soaking wet, their robes and tunics torn a dozen places by thorns and sharp branches along the track, laden with rough packs of food and blankets. They looked more like a group of wandering vagabonds than the Emperor and his two principal advisors. Then he glanced at the swords the two men wore. Horus's long and straight in the Arloan style, and Shukin's katana, shorter, double-hilted, and slightly curved. There was no mud there, he knew. Both blades, inside their scabbards, were scrumptiously clean and razor-edged, a result of their owners cleaning and sharpening them each evening. When do you expect the scouts to come back in? Horus asked. 2 days before, Shukin had asked for volunteers among the Kikri to go back along their trail to look for some sign of Arisaka's position. There had been no lack of numbers willing to take on the task, and he had sent 4 of the fittest younger men back down to the mountain. It'll depend on how long it takes them to find Arisaka, Shukin said. I'm hoping we hear from them later rather than sooner. Horus nodded. If the scouts returned this evening, he thought, they would have a good cause to worry. Allowing for the fact that the lightly laden Kikri, expert in traversing this country, would travel much faster than Arisaka's men, they would still have to travel double the distance, there and back. If they returned in the next 12 hours, Arisaka couldn't be more than 2 days behind them. How far now is Rankoshi? Shiguru asked. Shukin shrugged in reply. Toru says about 5 leagues, as the crow flies. Horus grimaced. We're not crows, he said, and Shiguru smiled tiredly. More's the pity. 5 leagues was more than 20 kilometers, Horus estimated. But traveling up and down ridges as they were, and traversing around rearing mountainsides, the distance they covered on the ground could be 5 or 6 times as much as that, and it would be hard going all the way. We should be there in 4 days if all goes well, Shukin said, hopefully. Neither Horus nor Shiguru replied, although Horus couldn't help asking himself the question. Why should things start doing that now? They heard voices raised farther back down the column, and they all rose and turned to see what was causing the disturbance. Horus saw 2 young men trotting tiredly up the track, past the rows of resting Kikri, who called questions to them as they came. The 2 arrivals shook their heads in answer to the questions. Unlike most of the travelers, they were lightly dressed, without heavy robes or cloaks to protect them from the chill air of the mountains. They wore breeches and shirts and stout leather boots, and carried small packs that could have held only the barest minimum of food and water. They were dressed and equipped to travel quickly, and Horus felt a cold hand close over his heart as he recognized 2 of them as 2 of the scouts Shukin had sent back. This doesn't look good, he said, noting the serious expressions on the arrivals' faces. Shukin grunted in reply, and the 3 of them moved down the track to meet the scouts. The young men saw them and redoubled their pace, dropping to one knee and bowing their heads before the Emperor. Gently, Shiguru put them at their ease. Please stand, my friends. This muddy track is no place for ceremony. He looked around and saw several interested bystanders watching them, curious to know what the scouts had discovered. Could someone bring food and a hot drink for these men, and warm clothing? Several of the bystanders hurried away to do his bidding. The remainder crowded a little closer, eager to hear the report. Shukin glared at them and waved them back. Give us room, he said. You'll hear the news soon enough. Reluctantly, they backed away, although their eyes remained riveted on the small group. Shukin ushered the 2 scouts to the spot where they had recently been resting. Sit down and rest first, he said. They sank gratefully to the wet ground, unslinging their packs. One of them began to speak, but Shukin held up a hand to stop them. Eat and drink first, he said as food and hot tea were placed before them. The people who had brought the food lingered, wanting to hear what the scouts had to report, but Shukin's quick glance and a jerk of his head moved them away. Horus realized that his order for the men to eat first was more than simple kindness. He didn't want anyone to overhear what they had to say. The scouts noisily slurped down their bowls of rich pork broth and noodles. As they ate, Horus saw the strain and weariness fading from their faces. Shukin waited till they had eaten most of the noodles. You found Arisaka? He said quietly. Both men nodded. One, his mouth momentarily full of hot broth, looked to his companion to answer. His army's barely a day's travel from here, the scout said, and Horus heard Shukin's quick intake of breath. Shiguru, as ever, seemed unmoved by the news, simply accepting it for what it was. A day? Shukin repeated, in a troubled voice. He ran his hands through his hair. Horus recognized the distress in his action. Burdened with the task of keeping his emperor safe, Shukin could see his enemies drawing ever closer. How could they be moving so quickly? The first scout had gained his voice now. Arisaka is driving them cruelly, my lord, he said. He is determined to take Lord Shikuru. His men won't thank him for it, Horace said thoughtfully, but Shuken made a dismissive gesture. His men will accept it. They're used to his lack of regard for their well-being. He looked up at the scouts. Where are your two companions? They stayed behind to watch Arisaka, he was told. When he gets within half a day's march, they'll come on to warn us. At the rate he's catching up, that should be sometime late tomorrow, Shuken said thoughtfully. He unrolled the map of the mountains that he and Toru had drawn up and pondered it. Arisaka was a days away from their present position. If they moved out now and kept moving, they would extend the time it would take him to catch them, but even so, he was making ground on them too quickly. He looked up and nodded his gratitude to the scouts. Thank you both. You've done well. Now go and get warm clothing, and a little rest. We'll be moving out shortly. They bowed and turned to go, but he called them back. Ask Toru to come here, would you? He said. They nodded and trotted away. Horace and Shiguru said nothing as Shuken studied the rough chart, tapping his fingers on his chin as he did so. A few minutes later, Toru arrived. You sent me, Lord Shuken? Yes, never mind that, Shuken said, waving away Toru's formal bow. Sit down here. The Kikiri guide sank to his knees, feet folded under him. Horace shook his head. He could hold that position for only a few minutes, and then his knees and thighs would begin burning. The locals, he knew, could sit comfortably for hours in that pose. Arisaka is a day away from this point, Shuken told Toru. The guide showed no sign of emotion at the news. At the current rate he's catching us, we've probably got a day and a half, maybe 2 days if we push the column as hard as we can. He paused to let Toru absorb this information. How long do you think it will take us to reach Rankoshi? The Kigiri raised his eyes to meet Shuken's. At our current speed, at least 4 days. Shuken's shoulders sank. He had expected the answer, but had been hoping against hope that Toru might have better news. Then we have to find some way to delay him, Shuken said, after a moment's thought. Toru's face brightened, and he reached for the map, turning it toward him and studying it. Then he jabbed a forefinger at a spot. Here, Lord, he said. This ravine is impassable, except for a simple footbridge. If we destroy it, Arisaka will have to take a long detour, along this ridge, down another, then across this narrow valley. Then he will have to regain all that ground lost. His hand swept in a long curve across the map. It would take him several weeks. Shuken nodded in satisfaction. Excellent. We'll destroy the bridge. When will we reach it? Toru's face fell as he saw the fault in his suggestion. Lord, the bridge is 2 days away. Arisaka will catch us before we reach it. There was a long silence. Then Shuken took the map and deliberately rolled it and replaced it in the leather tube that protected it from the elements. Then we'll have to buy a little more time along the way, he said. Alright, so we're on chapter 21 now. We finished 4 chapters. 5 chapters, I think. I don't know. But doing good so far. I'm liking it. We got 2 different stories going on at the same time. I know, because I read the book before, that we're eventually going to have those 2 stories merge into